All right. Well, why don't we get started here? I think it's time. So, welcome everybody to the Catholic Current for the second semester. My name is Annette Donovan Pancho. For those who don't know me, I am one of the campus ministers at King's University College, and I am absolutely delighted today to have Murray Watson, Dr. Murray Watson, here with us to talk to us about the Abrahamic faiths. Dr. Murray is the adult faith animator for Simcoe, Muskoka. Oh, the school board. I couldn't read my own handwriting. I apologize. He's based in Barrie, I guess a snowy place today, and at this time of the year more so than here. He's also a biblical scholar and has been a biblical scholar for years. He's been working on interfaith dialogue for 25 years, and he spent a great deal of time living and teaching in the Holy Land. So this is his firsthand experience that he'll be here sharing with us today. And he's going to talk for about a half an hour, and then folks will be able to type in their questions into the Q&A section, and he'll be able to answer any questions that we have. Anyway, without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to you, Murray. I am so excited to, I've heard you speak before. You've done so much work at King's, and I'm just really looking forward to hearing you once again. So thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity, Annette. Thank you to all of you. It's a joy to be part of this series. Annette didn't mention I'm a double King's grad. I spent the better part of 8 years in or around King's. So it's nice to be able to give a little something back to a community that gave me a lot over the course of the years and where I still have a lot of colleagues and friends. So welcome everybody, and thanks for being here on this Thursday afternoon. So let me just see if I can make the technology work to bring up my PowerPoint. There we go. I think we have liftoff. All right, so our topic this afternoon is the Catholic Church and Abrahamic faiths, and I've actually put the other Abrahamic faiths because, of course, the Catholic Church is part of that family that we call the Abrahamic faiths. And I thought maybe before we got too far into the discussion, it might be worth just pausing for a second to talk about that terminology of Abrahamic and what does it mean. Traditionally, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all claim to be descended from the biblical patriarch Abraham. And if you read the story in Genesis in the Old Testament, Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, but they were born to him by different mothers. Ishmael was born to his wife and concubine Hagar. Isaac was born to his elderly wife, Sarah. And so traditionally, Judaism and Christianity have traced their descent through the family of Isaac and his descendants, and Islam has traditionally traced its descent through the family of Ishmael. So all three of those religions trace themselves back to the figure of Abraham through his two wives and his two sons. So in that sense, all of us claim Abraham as our common ancestor and the foundation of our religious traditions. This is an excerpt from a major Roman Catholic document, and for many of us today, it's pretty unremarkable in the way that it speaks about Judaism, Islam, and the other world religions. It says, "The Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in the world's great religions. She regards with sincere reverence those ways of conduct and of life, those precepts and teachings which, though differing in many aspects from the ones she holds and sets forth, nonetheless often reflect a ray of that truth which enlightens all people. The Church therefore encourages her children that through dialogue and collaboration with the followers of other religions, carried out with prudence and love, and in witness to the Christian faith and life, they recognize, preserve, and promote the good things, spiritual and moral, as well as the socio-cultural values found among these groups." That text is taken from a declaration that is actually 55 years old now, from the Second Vatican Council called Nostra Aetate, which is Latin for in our time, in our age, which was the Council's main statement about how the Catholic Church understood its relationship to non-Christian religions. By today's standards, Nostra Aetate is fairly bland, and most people would take most of those principles for granted in 2021. But back in 1965, that proved to be one of the most controversial and hotly debated documents to come out of Vatican II. And there were several points where it was doubtful that it would even make it to a final vote among the bishops. And what made it so controversial was the idea that religions other than Roman Catholicism could possibly be channels of truth, virtue, and holiness, which was a pretty radical idea in the minds of many Catholics at that time, and certainly for many of the bishops who were gathered for the council. Nostra Aetate seemed to butt up against a couple of long-held theological axioms that were largely taken for granted by Catholics and Catholic theologians. The first, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, outside of the church there is no salvation, which was first enunciated by St. Cyprian of Carthage back in the 3rd century, and error non habet jus, error has no rights. That is, anything that contradicted the revealed truth of Christianity did not have the right to be publicly professed or affirmed in any way, especially in majority Christian societies, which included most of Europe at the time. Christianity has, for many centuries, viewed Judaism, or for many centuries did view Judaism as a cursed religion that had been rejected by God because of its rejection of Jesus as God's son and the promised Jewish Messiah. So this text, which is taken from a Catholic catechism published in the mid-19th century, sums up some of the traditional Catholic beliefs about Jews and Judaism. It was through envy and jealousy that the Jews put Jesus Christ, their brother of the race of David, to death. The blood of Christ, which spoke mercy for the just, drew down the vengeance of heaven on the Jews. The Jews, in punishment of their crime, were banished from their country and dispersed over the face of the earth. So up until the middle of the 20th century, those were beliefs that were still very widely held among Catholic Christians. Today, the Vatican sends out official messages to the world's Jewish communities every year for the high holy days, which include Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and sends messages to the world's Muslims for the end of the holy month of Ramadan. This has been going on now for decades, but most Catholics would likely be unaware of it because it's done in a fairly discreet, fairly understated way. The Vatican doesn't make a big deal about it. They just send the messages out and let them reach those communities through word of mouth and church channels. And of course, today, the Pope regularly gathers with religious leaders from the world's great faith traditions for discussions, for prayer. On the left, we have Pope Francis with his best friend, Rabbi Abraham Skorka, who is a rabbi from Buenos Aires, Argentina. And before he was Pope, when he was still Cardinal Bergoglio, the two of them published a book together, which is called On Heaven and Earth, down in the bottom left. It was the first and only book the Pope had published, and he published it with his friend, his best friend, a Jewish rabbi, and they remain really good friends today. But as you can see in the pictures on the right, the Pope, both Pope Francis and his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, regularly have met with the leaders of the world's religions at international gatherings for prayer and for discussion. So of course the question is, what has changed so dramatically in the last 75 years that has enabled that kind of transformation of thinking and acting? And that's what I'd like to explore a little bit with you this afternoon, recognizing this is a very, very big topic and we can't do it justice except in the most superficial of ways. There are basically, I think, three main historical and theological causes to that transformation. Firstly, the experience of the Holocaust, or as it's often called today in Hebrew, the Shoah, the devastation, and the critical self-examination that happened after that. Secondly, the lived experience of many of the missionary bishops who attended Vatican II, who had lived as Christians in largely non-Christian cultures. And thirdly, a renewal of biblical studies in Catholicism that had begun at the end of the 19th century. So first off, the experience of the Holocaust or the Shoah and the critical Christian self-examination afterward. On the top left, we have people in one of the concentration camps, Jews in one of the concentration camps imposed by the Nazis. At the bottom right, we have a Nazi gathering, and if you notice the bishops, the two bishops on the right, the left, are both giving the Hitler salute with their right hands. This is part of the trouble that Christians would have to grapple with after the war. The questions that the Christians were struggling with: how were the Nazis able to so easily draw upon and build upon longstanding Christian theological stereotypes and prejudices about Jews to fashion a political anti-Semitism? Why were tens of millions of European Christians apparently okay, more or less, with the Nazis' ideology and actions? Why did so few European Christians stand up for their Jewish neighbors who were being harassed, arrested, and shipped off to concentration and death camps? How had there been such a massive failure of Jesus' commandment to love others, especially the weak and the suffering? So in 1945, with the end of the Second World War, these were some of the questions that pastors and theologians and Christians, especially in Europe, were forced to ponder. In 1960, in June, as Vatican II was still being prepared, a very prominent French Jewish historian by the name of Jules Isaac, or Jules Isaac, who had lost much of his family to the Holocaust, met with Pope John XXIII in Rome. Isaac had spent years researching Christian theological history, trying to understand why it was that Christians were so hostile to Jews and viewed them so negatively. And he concluded that many of the ideas Christians had about Judaism were actually warped and inaccurate. And so he brought his dossier of research to the Pope, and he asked him to make a revision of Catholic teaching on Judaism one of the agenda items for Vatican II. Now, the Pope had been a Vatican diplomat during the war. He had seen the Holocaust up front. He had acted with great concern for threatened Jews. He had saved many hundreds of lives with false church documents. He understood Isaac's plea, and he established a commission to begin drafting a document for the bishops at Vatican II that was to be called the Decretum de Iudeis, the Decree on the Jews. The second factor in the transformation was the lived experience of many of the missionary bishops who attended Vatican II as Christians who were living in largely non-Christian cultures. These were bishops, some of whom had spent decades living and working among non-Christians in countries that were majority Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh, or where there were indigenous spiritualities among the cultures. And their experience of truth and holiness and goodness among non-Christians had convinced them very powerfully that God was obviously active beyond the bounds of Christianity. They had come to see positive values in those religious traditions, and they believed that a negative view of them was going to be inaccurate. So when the first drafts of the Decree of the Jews were presented, many of them argued the document needed to go beyond just Judaism and should say equally positive things about other faiths that could provide guidelines for Catholics to engage positively with other religions. The third factor, I think, is a renewal of biblical studies in Catholicism that began at the end of the 19th century. As many of you, if you know the history of Christianity, will know, for many centuries, Catholics had tended to shy away from the Bible after the Protestant Reformation, seeing it as a predominantly Protestant book, a potentially dangerous book for Catholics. At the end of the 1800s, Catholic scholars began to take a new interest in the Bible in its original languages. And that led them to begin rethinking the Christian-Jewish relationship, which they began to view in the light of some passages in the New Testament that had been largely downplayed or overlooked or ignored over the centuries, that spoke very positively about the Jews, especially chapters 9 to 11 of St. Paul's letter to the Romans, where we find texts like this. In chapter 11, verses 17 to 18, if some of the branches, and by this St. Paul means the Jews, were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, the non-Jews, were grafted in their place to share the rich root of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches. Remember that it is not you that support the root, but the root, which is Judaism, that supports you. And a few verses later, in verses 28 to 29, as regards God's choice, they, the Jews, are beloved for the sake of their ancestors, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Now, they noticed that in that first passage, St. Paul spoke of Judaism as supporting Christianity, as being foundational, as nurturing Christianity. And they noted that in the second passage, St. Paul speaks in the present tense. The Jews are beloved, he says, not were once beloved. This is very different from the predominant theological views and the many negative perspectives that Jules Isaac had been cataloging for decades. So suddenly there was a shift in what portions of the New Testament Christians were focusing on when they thought about the Christian-Jewish relations. And these were two of the key texts that Vatican II considered. The result of those three factors was a nearly 4-year debate that finally yielded in October of 1965 the declaration that today we call Nostra Aetate, the Catholic Church's first major document that could speak of other religions in positive terms, that showed appreciation for them, that encouraged interreligious dialogue. Judaism, which had originally been the catalyst for the document, still retains a central place in it. Roughly 1/3 of the document is still focused on the Jewish-Christian relationship. But over the course of those years, the document had been considerably expanded, and it now included reference to some of the other major world religions like Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and it included some basic principles for a Catholic approach to other faiths. The movement of interreligious dialogue was given considerable momentum by the nearly 27-year papacy of Pope St. John Paul II. He visited the Holy Land in the year 2000 as part of the Jubilee celebrations, and he left a very moving prayer between the stones of the Western Wall in Jerusalem, which was where devout Jews had been going for centuries to leave their prayers to God. He also turned out to be the first pope to visit a Muslim place of prayer when he visited the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus in 2001, the first pope ever to visit a mosque in history. So you can see his example left a huge mark on the Catholic Church in terms of the Jewish and Christian relationship, and his teachings on Judaism alone were compiled into a full book-length volume that is called The Saint for Shalom. And his predecessors continued in his footsteps. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI also visited Israel. You see him at the top right with the late Shimon Peres, the president of Israel. He visited a mosque as well, in the bottom right. And he hosted large gatherings of interreligious leaders and Christian leaders from around the world, as we see on the left. And of course, Pope Francis has done much the same. He has visited the historic Synagogue of Rome, the Tempio Maggiore, on the left. On the top right, we see him visiting a synagogue and being given a tour by a Muslim imam. And in the bottom right, we see him gathered with many of the world's religious leaders in the city of Assisi, reflecting on interreligious peace in the city of St. Francis. So we've gone from 1965, Nostra Aetate, a document which took up roughly a page and a half of typed space. And today, the official printed collection of the Catholic Church's teaching on interreligious dialogue is nearly 1,250 pages long. And that only goes to 2005, to the end of the papacy of Pope St. John Paul II. It doesn't include the last 16 years. And of course, there is a massive amount that has happened under Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis that isn't included. Certainly, it would be a book of over 2,000 pages today if we were to include what has happened in the last two papacies under Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. So if we look at some of the recent statements that have come out from the Vatican, official statements about Judaism and Islam, we can gauge just how much that growth in friendship has changed the language and the approach of the Catholic Church to the other Abrahamic faiths. So in 2015, to mark the 50th anniversary of the statement from Vatican II, the Vatican's Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews published a document called The Gifts and the Calling of God Are Irrevocable. And this is just one paragraph. The dialogue with Judaism is, for Christians, something quite special, since Christianity possesses Jewish roots which determine relations between the two in a unique way. In spite of the historical breach and the painful conflicts arising from it, the Church remains conscious of its enduring continuity with Israel. Judaism is not to be considered simply as another religion. The Jews are instead our elder brothers, as St. Pope John Paul II called them, or our fathers in the faith, as Pope Benedict XVI would refer to them. In terms of Islam, the Pope and the head of one of the great Islamic universities and centers of thought, Al-Azhar University, came together in 2019 to publish a joint statement that was called On Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together. Fascinating, beautiful, inspiring document. And here's just a couple of lines from that. Al-Azhar al-Sharif, which is one of the most respected Islamic universities in the world based in Cairo, and the Muslims of the East and West, together with the Catholic Church and the Catholics of the East and West, declare the adoption of a culture of dialogue as the path, mutual cooperation as the code of conduct, reciprocal understanding as the method and standard. So that basically sketches out what the importance the dialogue has, and in a statement between Christians and Muslims that would have been unthinkable 30 or 40 years ago. And if you follow the writings and the speeches of Pope Francis, you know that he is constantly speaking about dialogue. It's one of the most important words in his vocabulary. And just some texts to give you a sense of how does he speak about dialogue. In a speech in 2016, he said, "If there is one word that we should never tire of repeating, it is this: dialogue. We are called to promote a culture of dialogue by every possible means, and thus to rebuild the fabric of society. The culture of dialogue enables us to view others as valid dialogue partners. Today, we urgently need to engage all the members of society in building a culture which privileges dialogue as a form of encounter." In 2018, he said, "An attitude of openness and truth and love must prevail in dialogue with believers of non-Christian religions, despite the various obstacles and difficulties, particularly fundamentalism on both sides. True openness means remaining firm in one's own deepest convictions and therefore being open to understanding others." And in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti that he published last October, he says, "Dialogue between the followers of different religions does not take place simply for the sake of diplomacy, consideration, or tolerance. In the words of the bishops of India, the goal of dialogue is to establish friendship, peace, and harmony, and to share spiritual and moral values and experiences in a spirit of truth and love." And there are dozens and dozens of speeches and writings in which Pope Francis reflects on dialogue in general and interreligious dialogue in particular. As I say, it's one of the most prominent themes in his papacy, in his public pronouncements. So one of the great transformations of the 20th century has been this relationship, this renewed relationship between Christians and Jews and Christians and Muslims. In the space of roughly 2 generations, interreligious dialogue went from being something that was condemned and rejected by the official Catholic Church to something that is today energetically endorsed and modeled by the Catholic Church. And it has made the Catholic Church one of the great leaders and pioneers in this field that many other churches and religious groups look to for guidance and advice as to how to engage in that kind of fruitful dialogue. And the relationship of Catholicism to those 2 other Abrahamic faiths, Judaism and Islam, continues to be a model of how authentic dialogue can utterly transform relationships that had been for centuries painful, negative, tense, and toxic. So it's a reminder to all of us that there is no relationship, there is no situation that is beyond changing. As one of my rabbi friends said, if the Catholic Church and the Jews can become friends after 1800 years of hostility and pain, certainly almost anything can be healed and anything is possible. As children of Abraham, as Christians and Jews and Muslims, we can only suspect that that transformation is something that would bring joy to Abraham, our father, and to Sarah and Hagar, the mothers of our respective faiths. Thank you. So I'm going to stop with the screen. That is basically the essence of my presentation this afternoon, and open things up for some reactions, some thoughts, some questions from all of you. As I say, I'm very conscious. This is something that we could do an entire year course on. But I would love to hear some of your thoughts, your reflections. Is this new to you? Is this material you're already familiar with? How do you react to it, and what kinds of questions does it raise for you?
Thank you so much. So I am looking forward to seeing comments and questions in the Q&A section. You've given us so much to think about, I think. So as I knew you would, but I really appreciate it, especially seeing that progression of the relationships between really the popes and the Jewish, and then later on the Muslim imams. It's just, it's very inspiring, actually.
Well, it's exciting because we are seeing it unfold in front of us. We are seeing history being made in front of us. For anybody who knows that history, to see what's happening in our lifetime is so incredible. And to know that we are witnessing it, but also that we're called to be part of it. That each one of us has a role that we can play in moving that forward and keeping the momentum going, so that it's not lost, and so that we hand on to our children and their children a better, more peaceful world, a world of dialogue rather than a world of conflict and tension.
Yeah. Are there any questions or comments from the audience? Would love to see that. I'll monitor the Q&A box. I was glad you mentioned actually in the Fratelli Tutti, because that I was really struck when I read that, discovering that in fact it was his relationship with, and I'm going to butcher the poor gentleman's name, but Grand Imam Ahmed Al-Taliab. And
Yes.
and then when you were talking about what came out through the Muslim community a year before on fraternal relationships, it makes sense. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
So we have a couple of comments here. Jan says, I really appreciated your description of how the Catholic Church changed its thinking after World War II. This is all new for me. So,
and this is one of the things that surprises me. I speak on this topic a lot in a lot of different places, including a lot of Catholic parishes. These are not new documents. As I say, Nostra Aetate is from 1965, and almost everywhere that I speak about this, people say, I've never heard this before. This is totally new to me. This is refreshing. This is great. This is wonderful. Why has nobody ever told me this before? I had one gentleman who stood up at one talk and he said, I'm 78 years old and I have gone to this church every Sunday of my life. And he said, why am I just finding about this when I'm 78 years old? He said, if I had known this 50 years ago, he said, I might have thought differently. I might have acted differently. He said, I'm excited that we're moving in this direction. He said, I just wish someone had told me earlier.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Randa says, we are a Jewish Catholic married couple. Are there any writings from Jewish leaders on this topic?
Well, there's been not so much on marriage, although there are some groups that, I think different groups approach this in different ways. And within Judaism, you'll know that there's a wide range of opinions on this, from the more orthodox end of the spectrum, which frowns upon marriage with other religions, to the conservative and the reform and the reconstructionist movements that celebrates it and welcomes it and supports interfaith families like that. So much of it depends on what stream of Judaism and what stream of Christianity you're connected with. The more conservative branches of both religions tend not to make it easy for interfaith families. The more liberal versions tend to be very welcoming and affirming and supportive. There's a wonderful family, there's a wonderful organization, I think it's called Mixed Blessings in the United States, which is made up of Christian and Jewish families. And they have resources and they have discussion groups and they have people who are specialists in this and rabbis and ministers who provide material to support. So if anybody's interested, I can certainly do a little more research and can try and provide some details, but I think it's called Mixed Blessings. Not a lot in terms of formal documents, because a lot of it boils down to the local community and how supportive the local community and the local religious leaders are. I think the Reform movement over the years has put out some statements around mixed marriages, and they are certainly fairly welcoming of Jewish and Christian couples and families in their congregations. But so much of it depends on the personality and the approach of the local religious leaders and how comfortable they want to make those families.
Thank you, Murray. Leonard writes, Murray, I didn't realize this was such an ongoing process. Growing up Jewish in a largely Catholic Quebec, I lived this change. I'm very pleased to learn of this ongoing growth in interfaith dialogue, understanding, and appreciation. And that's from Leonard Siegel.
Absolutely, and Leonard is a prime example of a Jewish Christian family that has been modeling that for decades, where both of them are very open to the faith of the other while still retaining their own distinctive identity. I think he and his wife Marilyn Mason are an amazing example of what that can look like and how it can be lived fruitfully and joyfully.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments that people have? Any other thoughts to ongoing?
What questions does this raise for you? You know, as you hear this, does it make you think differently? Does it make you wonder about things?
Randa says, thank you. What about writings from the Jewish perspective on Jewish Christians coming together?
There have been certainly for the last 15 years. There was one particular statement that came out, I think in 2001 or 2002, called Dabru Emet. I'll put it in the chat. If anybody is interested, you can Google it and find it. It was the first organized Jewish statement about Christianity, and it started with about 100 Jewish religious leaders and theologians. It was published as a full-page ad in the New York Times in 2001, and it was an attempt from a Jewish perspective to take into account the changes that had happened in Christianity in the last 50 years, and to welcome that from a Christian perspective and to say, well, what might that mean? How might Jews think differently about Christians as a result of that? There have been a couple of other documents since. There's one called, I think it's Between Rome and Jerusalem, which is a group of Orthodox rabbis reflecting on how they think things have changed in the last 50 years. And there's another one, I think, called For the Sake of Heaven and Earth, which is another group of Orthodox rabbis. For the longest time, Orthodox Judaism tended to step aside, not be involved in interfaith dialogue, because many of them were convinced that it was simply another Christian way of trying to convert people to Christianity. But now, after 50 years, they realize that it can be done in ways that are respectful of Judaism, that don't pressure Jewish people to become Christians. So there's many more Orthodox rabbis just in the last 5 or 10 years who've gotten involved in the dialogue. That's a fairly new phenomenon in Jewish-Christian dialogue. Thank you, Leonard. I see the comment.
Yeah, I was going to just draw your attention to that little note that that Leonard left you. A couple of more questions or comments. Sandra says, this was a wonderful presentation. I am 81 years old, and this is the first time I have heard the history beginning with Abraham. Thank you for this. It makes so much sense.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon. I'm glad, as somebody who's in your 80s, you have literally witnessed the entire arc of this evolution. So thank you.
Michael writes, I'm glad for the prayers of the faithful on Good Friday. That was my first knowledge of how we appreciate other faiths.
And it was, the prayers of the faithful that most of us are familiar with in the Catholic Church changed in 1969 and 1970 as a result of the liturgical reforms of Vatican II. Prior to that, the prayers on Good Friday had been quite harsh on the Jewish people. They had been prayers for the conversion of the Jewish people from their blindness. They started out by saying, God, who does not reject in your love even the Jews. And during those liturgies for the longest time, that was the one of the 9 prayers on Good Friday for which the congregation did not kneel. And for all the others, you would kneel and you would stand. But the theologians had said, that liturgical theologians had said, since the Jews would not kneel before Jesus as their king, neither will the Christian people kneel for the Jews. So there was a lot of pain around that particular prayer. And the version that we have now is a very respectful, beautiful prayer that speaks about the Jewish people as the first to hear the word of God. And we pray that God will continue to guide them more deeply into their knowledge of his love and in faithfulness to their covenant relationship with him, which is 180 degrees different from the prayer that was prayed for hundreds of years on Good Friday. So Good Friday is no longer the painful time it once was, even though the gospel reading, the passion reading on Good Friday can be a little problematic in the way that it speaks about the Jews, and we need to have some background about that to contextualize it and not to use it in ways that can be anti-Semitic and really hurtful to the Jewish people.
And Randa says, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. Have any of you been involved in this kind of dialogue, in your own lives, in your communities?
Waiting to see some answers, some
Well,
responses.
one of
It's
the
hard to
beautiful-
type too.
One of the beautiful things that has come out of Catholic reflection on interreligious dialogue is the fact that this belongs, that everybody can be involved in this. Some people think that interreligious dialogue is just for people with degrees in theology who meet at international conferences and things like that. But the Catholic Church is really, really clear that there's a place in interreligious dialogue for everybody, and they speak about different modes of dialogue. So certainly there is the dialogue of experts who get together at university, conferences, and who go to, who debate the fine points of theology with each other because they have years and years and years of training in that. But that's a very small part of interreligious dialogue. There's also the dialogue of everyday life, where we have neighbors and friends and coworkers and in-laws who belong to other faiths. The interest that we show in them, the love that we have for them, the curiosity that we have in the conversations that we have with them about their faiths is all part of interreligious dialogue. So if you have Jewish neighbors and your Jewish neighbors invite you over for the lighting of the candles for the nights of Hanukkah, or invite you to a Passover Seder, or invite you to their synagogue for their child's wedding or bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, that's interreligious dialogue. It doesn't have to be done by specialists. Just by showing love and curiosity and respect for our neighbors, we're already moving the work of interreligious dialogue forward. Coming together at times when we can pray and reflect together. Certainly, I think about disasters and terrible, terrible things like 9/11 that have happened, or massacres in synagogues and mosques. When we come together to pray as a community in sorrow or to support one another in solidarity, that's the work of interreligious dialogue as well. So we need to think of it broadly and as something that each one of us can make a contribution to by the choices we make and the relationships we engage in. Leonard is commenting. Yes,
sorry, Leonard writes, I remember when you founded the Center for Jewish Catholic Muslim Learning at King's that has contributed to interfaith dialogue events in London.
I was very fortunate to be one of the co-founders of that with two of the rabbis in London who've since moved on, one of whom has since died. But yeah, that must be close to 15 years ago now that we set that up, and it continues to bear fruit at King's. One of the great things that King's has been a venue for and a catalyst for has been an interfaith peace camp every summer that brings together young people from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam together with a team of adults and religious leaders who work with them in really creative ways to help them understand and appreciate the beauty of each other's faith, that bring them on tours of different houses of worship, that teach them words of greeting and prayer in each other's faith. Annette, I suspect you've probably been involved with that over the years. Are
Actually,
you?
Maya's the one who runs that, but my youngest daughter has been involved in that for I think 4 or 5 years now.
And
And
what have you heard from her about that experience, or what has the
oh,
impact been on her?
she's been so enriched by it. You know, it's actually it's funny because she after the first summer she came home and said, how come we don't get to do any cool things like my Muslim friends do? And which was, it's like, oops, that wasn't quite what we were wanting to go for. But I think it did give her ultimately a real appreciation for her own faith as well. And she's great for correcting everybody who says anything wrong. And like if we put the wrong slant in our own conversations at home, I think that could also be being the youngest. She likes to correct us, but she certainly does in that setting too. And it's been a real rich experience for our whole family as well. So,
Well, and I just think that's such an amazing thing that King's has been the center of
yeah.
that, and has provided resources and a place for that. And I know other parts of the country that have been very curious about that and have wanted to replicate that in different places. So I think that's a very concrete way that King's has modeled what good interreligious dialogue can look like when it's done creatively and thoughtfully.
Yeah.
I would love to see that replicated 1,000 times over all around the world. But
Well, it's interesting. Having gone virtual this summer, we actually had people from New York who were getting involved in the program that we're running. So I don't want to do a disservice to some of the questions that are starting to come in here. So Michael says, do you still send out commentaries each week? And if so, where?
I do. And if anybody is interested, I'll put my email address in the chat box. And if anybody is interested, I write some background each week on the coming Sunday's gospel, and I send it out to anybody who asks for it by email. So if you're interested, I'd be happy to.
And I know that because I know Jim reads them faithfully before he preaches on Sundays. Susan Marino says, for 25 years, my husband and children shared our faith festivals together with our Jewish neighbors and their children. They actually grew up together. We thought we were pioneers in this sharing, but now I see that this movement has been going on for decades. Thank you.
Absolutely. And the more people who are doing that, the more normal it becomes, and the more, let me tell you just a quick little story about London that's bittersweet in some ways. Some of you will know that on the far side of campus behind Brescia College, there is a convent, a monastery of the Sisters of the Precious Blood, who are a contemplative community who pray for the needs of God's people and who also make the altar breads that many of our parishes use. Across the street, they have neighbors who are Jewish. And years ago, the sisters, their neighbors said, we'd love to bring the sisters over for the first night of Hanukkah, and we'd like to have a little party. But because the sisters are a cloistered community, they normally don't leave the monastery. And they said, well, we really can't come, but why can't we have a Hanukkah party here at the monastery? So the sisters hosted a Hanukkah party for the Jewish family who lived across the street, and they got dreidels, and we had a potluck dinner with all kinds of wonderful food, and we spun dreidels, and we said the blessings and lit the candles for the first night. And that has been going on for years between that family, and now it's included other members of the community and the Precious Blood Sisters, and they all cherish it. And they said, why can't we do this? Why can't we as Christians celebrate and host our Jewish friends for such a special occasion? And it has done wonders. It's brought a lot of joy to both communities. The father of the family who started that tradition sadly died just before Christmas. But for many, many years, he was the one who lit the candles, and the Sisters of the Precious Blood have been great friends to that family. And it's just such a beautiful example of respect and mutual enrichment. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a great story. I didn't know that at all.
If you're talking to the Precious Blood Sisters, ask them. They'll be happy to tell you.
I will. Marcia writes, I only recently had these dots connected with respect to our shared Abrahamic lineage. My florist, who is Muslim, and I got into a discussion about our faiths, and she explained the connection like this. One brother went one way, and the other brother went the other way, but they were still brothers. Anytime we can share our faiths and share our traditions, we are enriched. Thanks, Murray, for this great talk and for bringing hope into this day.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And that's absolutely what it is. You know, we are part of a large family that has had lots of tensions in the past. You know, it's a somewhat fractured family. It has been somewhat dysfunctional and yet we all believe that we have this common bond in Abraham. And so we may be, you know, we may be distanced. There may be tensions in the family, but we're all still part of the same family. And that's the thing I think all three of our communities has come to realize in the last 50 or 60 years, that in many ways we are closer to each other. We have more in common than the things that separate us if we choose to focus on those things.
And Sandra writes, I've been involved in parishes, including Christ the King, that have given us the wonderful opportunity to attend a synagogue to mark a religious celebration, such as Passover. I would have benefited from more of the dialogue such as we heard today, and to be able to expand on this experience.
That's wonderful. And certainly King's has modeled it beautifully. They have relationships, you know, with the synagogues and with the Jewish communities and the Muslim communities in London. So the leadership of campus ministry, everybody involved in campus ministry at King's, has those relationships and cherishes those relationships. Because years ago, we said, you know, when we were talking to each other, why is it we only talk to each other when there's a crisis? Why do we only talk to each other when there's been a shooting or sadness? Wouldn't it be nice if we were friends in the good times, so that when the bad times came, we had each other on speed dial and we could call each other, knowing each other, you know, having already formed those friendships and being confident and comfortable with each other, so that we could, you know, when the painful times came, we could support each other and stand in solidarity. And that's the way it really has been. London is an example of that, and I've seen it over and over and over again, in ways that it doesn't happen in many other cities. So congratulations, London.
Yay, London. Is there anybody else who has any other comments or questions or thoughts that they would like to share? Again, Leonard, I appreciate that your presentation explained that this interfaith dialogue is expanding to become a discussion among world religions and indigenous cultures. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, actually. I appreciated that slide too that you were showing about that.
And for those of you who are coming from a Catholic background and who may have graduated from Catholic high schools or have children in Catholic high schools, you'll know that the grade 11 religion curriculum, the mandatory religion curriculum in Catholic schools in Ontario, is world religions. And it's been tightened a little bit in the last 4 or 5 years. So it's not all world religions now, it's the Abrahamic religions and Aboriginal spirituality. So we're putting a lot of emphasis, a lot of resources into making sure that our teachers have good material on that, and that our students have access to really thoughtful, accurate information. Right now, for example, we normally our teachers and our students would visit places of worship in the area as part of that course, which of course they can't do right now because of COVID-19. But what we have been able to do before the last lockdown was to go and do video tours with local mosques and synagogues, where their religious leaders have taken us on walking tours on video around their places of worship. And we've now been able to make those available to our teachers and our students, which is the next best thing. It's the best that we can do right now, but it allows them to see a face from the local community. It allows them to see the inside of their local mosque or the inside of their local synagogue, and to realize just how beautiful and how normal and how wonderful it can be to learn more about another faith. So we're putting a lot of energy across Ontario into helping our students really build those relationships of trust and understand those other religious traditions accurately and charitably.
Let's see. Just, is there any last thoughts?
Let me tell you a little story while we're waiting.
Yes, that'd be great.
When I first came back from my graduate studies, I started calling the synagogues in London to ask if I could have coffee with the local rabbis. And the rabbi at Or Shalom Synagogue, which is just behind St. Peter's Seminary over on Huron in Adelaide, said, "Why do you want to have coffee with me?" And I said, "I just want to have coffee." He said, "Oh, no, no. Christians don't just call me because they want to have coffee." He said, "They call me because they want to sit down and show me why I need to become a Christian and believe in Jesus to be saved, or I'm going to hell. Is that what this is about?" And I said, "No, I just wanted to have a coffee." So he said, "Okay, you can come over next Thursday." So we had a coffee in his office. And that was the start of almost monthly coffees for 6 or 7 months. And after about 7 months, he said, "You really did just want to have coffee, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes." But he said, "Well, you need to understand," he said, "that hasn't been my experience." He said, "When Christians call me and just want to get together," he said, "normally there's an agenda there." And he said, "Usually the agenda is to get me to become a Christian." So he said, "I apologize that I was so suspicious when you called, but you need to understand," he said, "I come from a people where 6 million of my people were killed during the Second World War." And he said, "And we don't want to lose any more." And he said, "And there are some Christian denominations that put great pressure on Jews to convert to Christianity." And he said, "And I don't like that." And he said, "And that was what I was afraid you were trying to do." And I said, "I get what you're saying." I said, "That wasn't what I was trying to do, but I can understand." And you realize that as a Christian entering into relations with Jews and Muslims, you bear in some ways on your shoulders some of the negative history that we have had with regard to those religions. But it also gives us the possibility of creating a new kind of future. We can change that if we choose to. Um, and that rabbi and I became really good friends, and good things came out of that. But I understand his suspicion, and there's a lot of people who think, really, can Christians really change their stripes after 1800 years and love Muslims and love Jews? And the answer is absolutely, we can and we should.
That's a great story. Thank you. Leonard writes, "I've been hosting a class annually at the synagogue in Sarnia to talk to them in French about Judaism and Jewish religious practice traditions. The
Beautiful.
teacher at the French Catholic school has asked for that." So,
Absolutely. And that's the kind of thing that should be absolutely normal for Catholic schools to, but it depends on relationships. And sometimes people are afraid to pick up the phone because they don't know the person at the other end. They've never been beyond the doors and the walls of that house of worship. And it seems exotic and it seems strange until you've been there, and until you've meet people and you realize these are people just like me, and I don't need to be nervous about them. I don't need to be afraid, but I do need to develop and foster relationships with them. And I think that's, if I could leave any message with everybody today, it's the importance of relationships. That building up those friendships is slow work. Sometimes it's patient work because there's lots of history there that we're dealing with that hasn't always been very pleasant. Um, but we can build better relationships for the future. And there's a wonderful rabbi from the 4th century that I love, Rabbi Tarfon, and he says, "It's not up to you to finish the work, but neither are you free to ignore it and turn aside from it." So I think that's the task for all of us is we can't fix everything. I can't fix everything in the Jewish Christian Muslim relationship. I can't undo 2,000 years of history, much of which has been negative, but I can start where I am. I can do what I can. I can show kindness and respect. I can show curiosity. I can learn more about those other faith traditions. I can choose to be different, and I can choose to contribute to making the future look different. So I can't do it all, but what I can do, I should do, and I think that's what all of us can do.
I think that's such a wonderful place to finish, Murray. I think that's terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. You know, everyone is, I'm hearing through the comments there and the questions, everyone's just appreciative of the time that you have spent with us, and really the hope and the encouragement that I think you have given each of us to go and continue to develop relationships, and not to be fearful. And even though in the midst of COVID, it might be a little more daunting, but still, I think we are called to reach out to our brothers and sisters in other faiths, and to always look for opportunities to learn more ourselves. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for giving me the invitation, and thank you to everybody who's joined us this afternoon. I hope it's been interesting. I hope it's been informative, and I hope it encourages you to think about what you can do in your own life, in your own circle of influence, in your own community, to nudge things in the right direction. I think that's what honors our religious traditions, is trying to move things in the direction of peace and understanding and respect and love. All three of the religions and lots of others agree on that.
Thank you. I can see all the thank yous coming in there. So I would encourage you to look at the chat box there, Marie. And just a word of thanks to everyone who has joined us today. I look forward to seeing you next week here. We'll be back again with Sister Libby Osgood from PEI. She's a professor in sciences, actually, and she will be talking next week to us about the relationship between faith and religion. So I look forward to seeing you then. Have a wonderful week and take care. See you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you so much, Marie.